In the deep freeze of December 1885, as every other rancher fought to chip ice from frozen troughs, Gary Coulter did something that looked insane. He painted the massive rock wall behind his cabin black. Not whitewash, not fence stain, thick, tar-black paint that drank the pale winter sun. His neighbors said the solitude had cracked him. His wife feared he'd lost his mind. But Gary was betting his family's survival on a single physics truth. A black rock could melt snow into free water, even in a blizzard, when every pump for miles turned to solid ice. Gary Coulter was a cattleman, not a scientist. He had buried too many calves under snow that could have melted if only he had water. In the basin where he homesteaded, well pumps froze solid by November, and breaking ice became a backbreaking daily ritual. Gary remembered something from his trapping days. A dark rock on a sunlit slope always melted a dry ring around itself. So he decided to paint the entire 100-foot rock wall behind his cabin black, betting the sun would free water from snow every day. His neighbors saw a fool. His wife saw a danger, and both would soon learn whether that black wall was a wellspring or a winter tomb. The winter of 1885 had already left its mark on the high basin long before the first deep snow. Come October, the shallow wells ran dry and the deep hand pumps froze solid despite being wrapped in burlap. Men paid $2 a barrel for water hauled 20 miles from the river, a fortune when a good steer fetched 30. Gary Coulter watched neighbors lose half their herds not to cold, but to thirst. Cattle ate snow, but snow didn't fill a cow's belly fast enough. They starved with white dust still on their muzzles. He'd buried 11 yearlings the year before, and everyone had died with a belly full of frozen crystals that never melted into water. Gary wasn't the kind of man who accepted things easily. He'd come west after the war with nothing, trapped beaver in the Bitterroots until the fur boom collapsed, then drifted east into the cattle country of the high plains. His cabin sat against a steep escarpment of black basalt, a wall of fractured volcanic rock that rose 100 feet on the north side of his claim. In summer, that rock radiated heat so fierce you couldn't touch it after noon. In winter, when the sun swung low and pale across the southern sky, the wall still caught light from mid-morning until late afternoon. It was the warmest spot on the entire homestead. The idea came to him in late September while he was repairing a broken wagon tongue near the base of the rock. He dropped a dark stone from the wall onto a patch of frost that had settled overnight. By noon, a dry ring of bare dirt surrounded that stone while the rest of the ground stayed white. He'd seen it before, 100 times, in the mountains during spring melt. Dark rocks always cleared their own space. They drank the sun and gave it back as heat. So Gary began wondering, what would happen if the entire wall were as black as that stone? No one around him understood the question. Most ranchers saw winter as a fight against cold, a problem solved by more firewood, thicker coats, heavier snow fences. Gary saw that as fighting the wrong enemy. Cold didn't kill cattle directly. Dehydration did. If he could turn snow into water without burning wood or hauling ice uphill from the creek, he'd solve the single deadliest bottleneck of a high plains winter. The wall could be his furnace, and the fuel was daylight. He bought 2 5-gallon buckets of lampblack paste from a supply trader at Fort Stevenson. The trader thought he was coating a barn roof for rain runoff. Gary let him think that. Back home, he mixed the paste with linseed oil and grease until it became a thick, sticky paint that could cling to vertical stone. For 3 days, he worked alone, scaling the broken face of the basalt wall with a rope and a heavy brush, covering every inch from the ground to 20 feet up with that tar-black coating. His wife, Hannah, stood below, holding their baby daughter as the wind whipped her coat. She didn't argue, but fear sat plain behind her eyes. Ben Larimer, the neighboring rancher to the south, was the first to confront him. Larimer was a hard-faced man who'd grown up on prairie winters and believed in nothing that couldn't be proved by muscle. He stood beside the corral fence, watching Gary work, and then laughed. The sound echoed off the rock face. "You think painting a cliff is gonna stop winter, Coulter," he said. Gary didn't answer. Larimer spat on the frozen ground and added, "I'll bring my shovel over when the blizzard buries your foolish hide." Some men just got to learn the hard way. But Hannah could see something her husband wasn't saying. She noticed that every evening when the sun dropped below the ridge, Gary would press his bare hand against the painted rock. The stone was warm, warmer than the air, warmer than the ground. It held heat long after sunset, and that was before any snow had even fallen. She began to wonder if perhaps the man she'd married was not crazy at all, but simply seeing a truth no one else had bothered to notice. The first test came on November 3rd, a light snowfall that dusted the basin with 2 inches of powder. Gary had built a simple trough along the base of the painted wall, a long wooden channel with a slight slope that fed into a buried barrel. He scraped snow from the ground and packed it against the black stone, then waited. The morning was cold, barely 10 degrees, but the sun broke through cloud cover by 8. Within an hour, a thin trickle of water began running down the painted surface. By midday, the trough held nearly a gallon. Clean, free water pulled from snow by nothing but sunlight and a dark rock wall. Gary watched it fill, his breath fogging in the cold air. For the first time since autumn, a tightness in his chest began to ease. The physics worked. It was simple, repeatable, undeniable. He walked back inside the cabin and told Hannah quietly, "It melts." She looked up from the fire, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. But the basin was not kind to early successes. The next night, the temperature plummeted to 20 below without warning. The water in the trough froze solid in under an hour. The barrel cracked along its bottom seam, and the black wall, which had seemed like a miracle the day before, now glistened under a sheet of ice like a dark tombstone. Gary stood beside it at dawn, staring at the frozen remains of his experiment, and understood with sickening clarity that the real test had not even begun. A light snow in November was not winter. The true blizzards, the ones that killed entire herds in a single night, had not yet arrived. And when they did, all this black paint would have to do far more than melt a dusting of powder. By the second week of December, the weather turned strange. An unseasonable warm spell melted snow across the basin for 3 days straight, flooding the ground with slush that froze again into treacherous sheets of black ice. The cattle broke through and cut their legs. One of Larimer's steers went down in a draw and froze there before anyone could pull it out. Then, just before sundown on the 14th, the wind died. The sky went pale gray, almost green at the edges, and the temperature began to drop so fast you could hear the cabin timbers groan in protest. Gary stood on the porch, watching the horizon, and felt the old fear rise again. A storm was coming, the kind that had buried the basin in 71 and left half the homesteaders dead or gone by spring. And this time, his family's survival would depend entirely on whether 100 feet of painted rock could outlast the full fury of a Dakota winter. The storm that struck the basin on December 15th did not roll in gradually like the winter rains farther south. It arrived as one single violent wall of white, hitting the cabin at dusk with a roar that shook the door timbers. Hannah pressed the baby to her chest and backed against the far wall while Gary wedged the latch with a length of iron. Within an hour, the windows disappeared behind drifts so thick that the stove light barely reached the glass. The black rock wall, the painted miracle that was supposed to save them, became invisible in the maelstrom. And the sun, the engine of the entire design, was gone. Gary waited through the night, feeding split pine into the stove while the wind screamed across the escarpment. Every so often he would step onto the porch, rope tied to his belt, and listen for the sound of water dividing, but there was none. The air was too cold, the clouds too dense. The black rock could not drink faint light through a blizzard. By morning, the only water in that cabin came from a single pot of melted snow on the stovetop, carefully shared among 3 people. The cattle outside were buried somewhere beyond the lean-to, their lowing lost to the storm. The second day brought no relief. The sky remained a flat gray ceiling, the temperature held at 30 below, and the painted wall seemed to mock their hope. Gary broke his way to the corral and found his 2 milk cows huddled against each other, frost matting their muzzles. He hauled snow inside by the bucketful, but melting it on the stove used precious wood, and the fire already demanded more than he could easily give. Hannah said nothing, but her silence was a sentence. The wall had worked once under a thin November sun, but now, in the true heart of winter, the sun was simply not there. By the third night, 48 hours into the storm, Gary understood that they were losing the race. The woodpile was shrinking too fast. The baby had developed a cough, and the water pot was down to a quarter-inch of dirty melt. He sat beside the stove, staring at the ceiling beams, counting the hours until he would have to make the impossible choice: burn the last dry fuel or risk walking to the river through a whiteout. Then, on the fourth morning, the wind shifted nor-northwest, and the dense overcast cracked open. A pale, weak sun spilled across the basin. Gary pulled on his frozen coat and stumbled outside. The painted wall emerged from the storm like a dark slab cut from another world. Snow still clung to its crevices, but the black surface immediately began to warm. Gary did not wait. He grabbed a shovel and began packing fresh snow against the lowest 5 feet of the rock, pressing it hard into the uneven surface as though sealing a wound. Within 30 minutes, the first trickle of water coursed down the painted stone. But the problem was storage. The wooden trough he had built now froze solid overnight, and the buried barrel he'd hoped would hold the flow had cracked at the base seam. Water pooled uselessly around his boots and turned to ice before it could be collected. Gary stared at the spreading sheet of milky frost and realized his mistake. Getting the snow to melt was only half the battle. The water had to survive long enough to be drunk, and in 30 below air, a barrel above ground was a coffin for liquid. He made the calculation in 30 seconds. The rock wall absorbed heat during the day and surrendered it slowly at night. If he could sink a storage tank directly into the ground at the wall's base, insulated by straw and the stone's own residual warmth, the water might remain liquid long enough to be dipped out each evening. He needed a new barrel, buried deep and wrapped in everything he could spare. So while the sun still shone, Gary tore apart the goat shed's winter bedding, dug into the half-frozen earth with a pickaxe until his shoulders screamed, and lowered a heavy oaken cask into the hole. He lined the pit with layers of straw and old grain sacks, then sealed the top with a wooden lid and a blanket of packed snow for insulation. By sundown, the cask held 6 gallons, and that night, for the first time in 3 days, Hannah drank without measuring each sip. But Gary knew what the rest of the basin would soon learn. The sun was not reliable at 30 below, and the wall's dark face could not work miracles every day. The real test would not be a single blizzard. It would be the long, grinding months when the sun hung low for only 5 hours a day, when a week of overcast could starve his system completely. And Ben Larimer was not wrong in his warning. A design that worked once was only luck. A design that worked all winter was something else entirely. On the 7th day, the deep cold broke, and the basin emerged blinking into a brittle, wind-scoured silence. Homesteaders began checking on each other. What they found was sobering. 3 families north of the Coulter claim had lost their entire water supply to frozen pumps and broken barrels. 2 men had taken frostbite trying to open a well cap with wet hands. At the Larimer place, a dozen yearlings were dead, not from cold, but from dehydration, their stomachs full of frozen snow that never turned to water. Larimer stood among the carcasses, his face like flint, and when he looked south toward the Coulter place, he saw the faint black scar of the painted wall gleaming above the drifts. He said nothing, but something inside him shifted. The laughter that had once come easily no longer came at all. Gary, meanwhile, was focused on a new problem. The water that trickled from the black wall was not clean. Soot, dust, and the chalky residue of the basalt itself clouded each gallon. The lampblack paint, heated and cooled day after day, began to leach a faint oiliness into the melt. The first cup Hannah drank left a bitter taste on her lips. Gary tasted it and knew immediately. They could survive on this for a while, but not indefinitely. The paint was a shortcut, and shortcuts always came with a hidden price. He needed to filter the water, and the only thing he had in abundance was snow-clean, pure snow that had not yet touched the painted surface. So the second innovation was born out of necessity. Gary built a simple wooden frame lined with a double layer of burlap stretched tight, perched above the new ketch barrel. He packed clean snow into this frame, and as the sun heated the wall behind it, the soft melt dripped through the cloth, leaving most of the soot behind. The resulting water was not perfect, but it was far cleaner, and the family could drink it without fear of slowly poisoning themselves. The filter became as essential as the paint itself. By the third week of January, the black wall was producing between 4 and 8 gallons of water on sunny days, and half that amount on overcast ones. The buried barrel, wrapped in straw and shielded by the stone's nighttime heat, rarely froze solid. The Coulter cabin did not thrive, but it survived while others were hauling ice from the river 2 miles away. Hannah began to notice that her husband no longer looked haunted when he glanced at the horizon. Something had loosened inside him. The gamble, the audacity of painting a cliff black, was no longer theoretical. It was demonstrably keeping them alive. And then, inevitably, the neighbors came. Not Larimer yet, but others who had heard rumors from the trader at Fort Stevenson. A wiry Irishman named Donovan appeared one morning with a broken wagon wheel as an excuse, and spent an hour asking questions about the dark wall. A family from the east slope rode over to see the strange formation they had spotted from the ridge. They all saw the same thing: a homestead that had not lost a single animal to thirst, a woman and child who looked well and calm, and a man who was calmly scraping snow into a trough while water ran freely from its lower edge. The secret was no longer secret. Gary welcomed them without bragging, just as he had once shown fellow trappers how to read snow in the Bitterroots. He explained the simple physics. The dark surface drank sunlight, heated the stone, and melted any snow pressed against it. The buried barrel stored the water. The burlap filter cleaned it. It wasn't magic. It was a cookstove made of rock and daylight. By the time the visitors left, each carried a small piece of the truth. But the larger truth, the one that would soon reshape everything in the basin, had not yet revealed itself. Because the black wall did more than serve one family. Its water was visible from the fence line, and the cattle of the village, thirsty and desperate, could see it running. The final challenge was not whether Gary Coulter could save his own. It was whether he could and would save everyone else. The cattle answered that question before any man could. By late January, the animals could smell the meltwater from half a mile away. They began drifting toward the Coulter fence line in the gray pre-dawn hours, their ribs sharp under frozen hides, their muzzles crusted white from failed attempts to eat snow. Gary found them there one morning, 28 head of mixed stock, not a single one wearing his brand. They stood motionless, staring at the black wall, lowing with a sound that was less protest than pleading. Thirst had rewritten every rule of ownership on the basin. Hannah saw him hesitate. She knew her husband had built something that could save their family, but the wall was now producing enough water on sunny days to fill 3 barrels, more than 3 people and 2 milk cows could ever consume. The surplus was real and it was visible. If he turned those cattle away, every rancher in the valley would mark him as a hoarder. If he let them drink, he would own a public waterworks without the county, the law, or a single neighbor asking permission. Gary Coulter, the man who had painted a cliff black, would become the keeper of the only reliable well in a thirsty basin. That was not a comfortable position for a man who valued solitude. The first trough went up the next morning. Gary built it from split pine sealed with pine tar, set it just inside the fence line so that cattle could reach it from the public trail without breaching the corral. The cold cracked his fingers while he worked. Ben Larimer rode past as the afternoon light began to fade, his horse picking carefully through the frozen slush. He stopped, looked at the trough, looked at the dark wall behind it, and then looked at Gary with an expression that held no mockery at all. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Larimer said something that surprised them both. "My yearlings are down, every last one." His voice was raw, as though the words had been dragged out over miles of frozen ground. "I've got 30 head left. They'll follow the scent to this trough by tomorrow." He paused. "I ain't asking for free water, I'll pay." Gary leaned on his hammer. The basin had a code. A man's water was his own, but a man's luck was expected to be shared. He named no price. Instead, he simply said, "Bring them." The walls got enough for today. By the following week, 30 of Larimer's cattle were drinking alongside a dozen from Donovan's place and a handful from the East Slope families. The trough became a daily gathering point, not just for animals but for men. But the wall was not infinite. The black paint absorbed the sun's weak winter light only for as long as the sun actually appeared. And the sun, in that part of the territory, was a miser. February arrived with a gray lid of cloud that pressed down on the basin for 11 straight days. The temperature held at 10 below. Snow fell in fine, dry grains that the wind packed into hard drifts. The painted rock, starved of direct light, began to cool. The trickle of meltwater slowed to a thin thread, then to a drip, then to nothing at all. Gary stood beside the wall on the fourth sunless morning, pressing his bare hand against the stone. It was cold. Not frozen, not yet, but cold enough that snow would sit against it for hours without changing. The engine had stalled. The trough ran dry within 2 days. The barrels beneath the ground held a small reserve, but that was meant for his family. The cattle that had learned to depend on the black wall now crowded the fence line, pushing against the rails, their desperate lowing audible inside the cabin. Larimer arrived with a shovel over his shoulder, his face hollow from lack of sleep. He didn't demand water. He just stood beside Gary, watching the gray sky with the weary patience of a man who had already buried too many animals. "What happens now?" Larimer asked. Gary didn't have an answer that would make anything better. He'd bet everything on the physics of solar absorption, and the physics had not failed. The sun had simply abandoned the battlefield. The storm itself was not the enemy this time. The deep, grinding absence of light was worse. But the crisis revealed something that no one had previously considered. The black wall, even when it stopped melting snow, continued to absorb enough diffused daylight to stay fractionally warmer than the surrounding air. The buried barrels, insulated by straw and the stone's residual heat, did not fully freeze. The water inside turned to slush, but it remained drinkable. Gary chipped through the ice layer each morning and drew out enough for his family and the milk cows. The surplus for the community was gone, but his own had not yet run dry. That small margin, that narrow escape, kept them alive while the clouds sulked overhead. On the 8th day, Hannah noticed something Gary had overlooked. The black paint was flacking. Where the freeze-thaw cycle had worked its teeth into the rock, thin curls of lamplight were peeling away, exposing gray basalt beneath. The surface that had drunk the sun so greedily now resembled a moth-eaten blanket. Gary ran his fingers over the stone and realized that the paint would not survive another full winter. The shortcut was temporary. The next year he would need a permanent solution, perhaps a rock wall built entirely of dark stone, or a masonry face sealed with iron pigment, or something he had not yet imagined. But for now, for this winter, the black wall was dying slowly. If the clouds had persisted for another week, the story might have ended in failure. But on the 11th day, the lid broke. The sun returned, pale and thin but real, and the black wall began to sweat within an hour. Meltwater trickled into the trough again, and the cattle returned as if summoned by instinct. The immediate crisis passed, but the real damage was done. The community now understood that the black wall was not a permanent well. It was a tool with limits, and those limits could kill. Larimer, however, had changed. The old rancher who had once laughed at a painted cliff now spent his evenings reading a borrowed copy of Practical Geology by the light of a tallow candle. He began asking questions Gary could not answer. What kind of rock held heat longest? Could a trench of black stones achieve the same effect without paint? Were there entire mountainsides that could be harnessed? The laughter had died, and in its place grew something far more dangerous: belief. Others followed. Donovan built a small test wall of stacked dark basalt behind his shed, using stones he had once cursed as worthless. Within a week, it was melting snow. The East Slope family painted a slab of exposed granite with chimney soot and got a trickle of water on the first sunny day. Word spread beyond the basin, first to Fort Stevenson, then along the wagon routes, then into the letters and journals of people who traveled west to settle. The black wall of Gary Coulter was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a technique. But for Hannah, the biggest change was smaller and closer. One evening, after the baby had fallen asleep, she watched Gary through the window. He was kneeling beside the base of the wall, packing new snow into the filter, his movements calm and certain. She realized that the haunted look in his eyes had not merely faded. It had been replaced by something she had not seen since the early days of their marriage: purpose. The black wall had not only watered their family, it had restored the man who built it, and that to her was a more valuable miracle than any trick of physics. The winter of 1885–86 did not end gently. March brought a second wave of blizzards that tested every water system in the territory. The black wall held through them all, battered but functional, its peeling paint still managing to capture enough sun between storms to keep the core supply alive. When the final snow retreated in April, the full tally of survival became clear. The Coulter cabin had not lost a single animal to thirst. In a winter where the basin as a whole lost nearly 200 head to dehydration and freeze, that fact alone was a verdict on the idea. But Gary, standing beside his faded black wall in the first real warmth of spring, was not thinking about vindication. He was looking at the flacking paint and counting the months until the next winter would arrive. The sun had saved them once. He would need something far more durable to survive the rest of his life. And that was when the real idea, the one that would change everything, began to form in the back of his mind. The black wall had been a desperate gamble, a bucket of paint thrown against a cliff. But what if a man could build a black hill? A deliberate structure, shaped and angled to harvest sunlight every winter, year after year, without repainting. What if this was not a trick at all, but the beginning of a whole new way of living in frozen country? The answer would require more than paint. It would require stone, sweat, and a plan that stretched far beyond one family's survival. And Gary Coulter was already measuring the ground. Spring came to the basin in a rush of meltwater and pale green grass, but Gary Coulter did not rest. While other ranchers tended newborn calves and repaired winter damage to their fences, he was hauling stone. Every morning for 3 weeks, he hitched his draft horse to a stone boat and dragged dark basalt boulders from the Talus Slope 2 miles north. The rocks were jagged, heavy, and black as charcoal. He stacked them against the painted cliff in a deliberate slope, a ramp of broken stone rising 12 feet from the base of the escarpment. The black wall was no longer just paint on a cliff. It was becoming a structure. Hannah watched him work from the porch, the baby asleep in a sling across her chest. She had learned to read her husband's silences over the years. This one was not desperation. It was design. He had spent the long winter nights scratching diagrams onto the back of an old flour sack, calculating angles, measuring the arc of the sun across the southern sky. The new wall would not be vertical like the cliff. It would slope backward, tilted to catch the low winter sun more directly, like a man leaning into a warm fire. The physics had not changed. The ambition had. Ben Larimer arrived on the third day of the stonework, leading a mule loaded with 2 heavy burlap sacks. He dumped them beside the growing ramp without ceremony. "Lamplack," he said. "2 more buckets from Fort Stevenson. Figured you'd need it." Gary looked at the sacks, then at Larimer, and understood. The old veteran who had once laughed at a painted cliff was now investing in its improvement. Something fundamental had shifted between them. The basin's code of survival had a new entry, and it was written in black paint. Together, they mixed the fresh coating in a heavy iron pot over an outdoor fire. The new formula was thicker, cut with less oil and more iron oxide powder that Larimer had salvaged from a rusted wagon bed. The pigment bound to the stone with a grip the old paint had never possessed. When they brushed it onto the stacked basalt ramp, the surface drank the sun almost immediately, warming under their hands within minutes of clearing shadow. The Black Hill, as Gary had begun calling it privately, was alive before it was even finished. By midsummer, the structure was complete. 20 feet wide at its base, 12 feet tall, sloping backward into the natural cliff at a 35-degree angle that Gary had calculated by watching the precise line of the December sun. The face was rough, broken, deliberately uneven, because Gary had learned that a smooth surface shed snow too quickly, while a jagged one held it in pockets where the stone's heat could work longer. Every detail was a lesson harvested from the previous winter's failures. The new system included 2 buried barrels instead of 1, connected by a clay pipe that Gary had traded a full steer to obtain. A second trough fed the overflow into a shallow basin for livestock, while the first remained devoted to clean household water. The burlap filter was replaced by a wooden tray lined with packed sand and charcoal, which stripped the last of the paint's bitterness from the melt. For the first time, the water tasted clean, sweet, even. Hannah drank a full cup on the day the sand filter went in and smiled without meaning to. Gary noticed. He remembered that smile through every cold morning that followed. The autumn of 1886 came early, and the basin braced for another winter. But this time, something had changed in the minds of the people living there. Donovan had finished his smaller black wall, a 10-foot stack of dark stone behind his barn. The East Slope family had painted another slab, and 2 more homesteads had begun collecting dark boulders before the first frost. The technique was spreading, not by lecture or pamphlet, but by the quiet, undeniable proof of survival. The winter of '85 had separated the basin into 2 groups, those who had water when the pumps froze, and those who had buried their animals. Everyone knew which group had included Gary Coulter. When the first real blizzard struck in late November, the Black Hill performed beyond Gary's expectations. The sloped face caught the low sun at an angle that kept the stone warm even on days when the air temperature never rose above freezing. The jagged surface held snow in its crevices long enough for the heat to work, and the meltwater flowed steadily into the buried barrels through the clay pipe. On the darkest, coldest days of January, when the sun appeared for only 4 hours, the Black Hill still produced 3 gallons of clean water, enough for the family, enough for the milk cows, enough to share. The public trough at the fence line never ran dry that winter, not once. Homesteaders from across the basin brought their cattle to drink, and with them came questions, respect, and a slow, grudging acceptance that the solitary man who had painted a cliff black had not been crazy after all. He had simply been ahead of the weather. But the true twist, the detail that would transform Gary Coulter from a local curiosity into a figure of frontier legend, came from an unexpected source. In late February, a government surveyor named Wallace Dunn arrived in the basin, mapping water sources for a proposed railroad extension. He had heard rumors of a homestead that survived on melted snow, a place where the pumps never froze because the pumps were not needed at all. Dunn was a practical man, educated in engineering, and he approached the Black Hill with the skepticism of someone who had seen 100 failed frontier inventions. He spent 3 days studying the structure. He measured the angles, recorded the temperatures, calculated the solar absorption rate of the painted basalt. On the 4th day, he sat at Gary's table and spoke words that Gary had never expected to hear from any official source. "This isn't just a survival trick," Dunn said. "This is a solar melt furnace. The principles are sound enough to use anywhere the winter sun is strong and the rock is dark." He paused, then added something that hung in the air like smoke. "I'm putting this in my report to the territorial governor." Hannah gripped the edge of the table. Gary said nothing. He simply nodded, the way he had nodded when Larimer asked how far apart to set the posts, the way he had nodded when Donovan brought his first bucket of lamplight. The idea was no longer his alone. It belonged now to the territory, and eventually to anyone who cared to listen. The railroad came through the basin in 1888, 2 years later, and with it came a small depot and a telegraph line. Wallace Dunn's report had circulated among engineers and surveyors, and the Black Hill was noted on official maps as Coulter's solar catchment. Homesteaders arriving on the new rail line carried instructions for building similar structures. The technique spread north into Montana, south into Wyoming, anywhere that winter sun and dark stone could be found together. Gary never sought recognition or profit. He simply continued to improve his wall, adding a 3rd barrel and a covered stone cistern that could hold 50 gallons without freezing. Years later, an elderly Ben Larimer sat on his porch in the warm autumn sun, watching his grandchildren haul water from his own smaller black wall, built from the same dark stone and angled to the same precise degree. A young reporter from a territorial newspaper had come to interview him about the early days, about the winter of '85 when the basin nearly starved for water. Larimer told the story slowly, his voice worn thin by age, and when he reached the part about the painted cliff, he stopped. "You know what that man did," Larimer said. "He didn't beat Winter. Nobody beats Winter out here. What he did was teach Winter to work for him instead of against him." The reporter wrote it down. The line appeared in the newspaper 2 weeks later, and it captured something essential that had been true from the very beginning. Gary Coulter had never claimed to defeat nature. He had simply studied it long enough to understand that the sun, even in the deepest cold, still carried heat. The dark stone was the key. The slope was the receiver. And the water, the free water that flowed every winter while every pump froze for miles around, was the proof. Gary lived to see his daughter married in the cabin beneath the Black Hill. He lived to see his son, born the year after the Great Blizzard, grow into a man who understood the physics of solar, melt as naturally as he understood the seasons. The Black Hill continued to produce water every winter for more than 30 years, its surface renewed with fresh pigment every few seasons, its barrels replaced when the old ones rotted. Travelers sometimes stopped to sketch it, and a few of those sketches found their way into archives far beyond the basin. But the final surprising detail, the one that even Gary had not anticipated, came from the cattle. After the winter of '86, the animals never forgot the Black Hill. Every autumn, as the temperature dropped and the pumps began to stiffen, herds from across the basin would begin drifting toward the Coulter fence line by instinct, lowing for the water they knew would be there. The animals had learned what the humans had taken years to accept. A black rock wall in winter sunlight was not a trick, not a gamble, not a desperate hope. It was simply a source of life, as reliable as a spring and far more reliable than any pump. Nature had taught Gary. Gary had taught the stone, and the stone was still teaching anyone willing to listen. The stone was still teaching anyone willing to listen. And that, perhaps, is the deepest truth of Gary Coulter's Black Wall. It was never really about paint, or basalt, or even water. It was about a man who stopped fighting the winter and started studying it. When every other homesteader on the basin was stacking firewood and cursing the cold, Gary was watching how snow melted around a dark rock. That single observation, small enough to miss, became the thread he pulled until an entire survival system unraveled into his hands. Think about what he actually did. He didn't invent anything that nature wasn't already doing. He simply looked at a south-facing cliff and asked, what if this worked harder? The black paint was not a machine. It was a multiplier of a natural process that had been running since the earth cooled. The sun hits dark stone. The stone warms. Snow melts. The only difference was that Gary closed the loop, captured the water, and trusted his family's life to the result. That trust was the hard part. Anyone can paint a rock. Very few can look at a frozen barrel on a 30-below morning and still believe the sun will save them tomorrow. But there's a larger question hiding inside this story. Why did it take a lone cattleman with no formal education to figure out what any scientist could have predicted? The answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes education teaches you what's impossible before you've had a chance to discover that it is not. The engineers who later studied Coulter's solar catchment confirmed that the physics were sound, that the slope angle was surprisingly optimal, and that the buried barrels leveraged geothermal stability in ways that mirrored modern passive solar design. But they arrived decades after the cattle had already learned to follow the scent of meltwater. Today, we have heated water troughs, electric well pumps, and insulated pipelines. We don't need to paint cliffs black to survive a Dakota winter. But the principle Gary Coulter proved remains stubbornly relevant. The cheapest, most reliable energy source on this planet is still the sun, even when the air is cold enough to crack steel. And the most powerful tool any person can carry into a hostile environment is not a gadget or a weapon. It is the willingness to observe carefully, to test humbly, and to learn from failure without abandoning the core idea. Gary Coulter failed more than once. His paint peeled. His filter poisoned the water. His first barrel cracked. The November storm nearly buried his experiment before it started. But each failure taught him something the textbooks hadn't yet written. Each disaster tightened the design. By the time the Great Blizzard of '86 arrived, the Black Hill was not a gamble anymore. It was engineered survival, built from sweat and stone and stolen daylight. And here's the part that lingers. In the end, the Black Wall served cattle that didn't belong to Gary, neighbors who had mocked him, and strangers who heard the story years later and built their own versions on distant homesteads. He never charged for the water. He never filed a patent or sought a government contract. When Wallace Dunn put the solar catchment into his official report, Gary didn't travel to the territorial capital to claim credit. He stayed home and rebuilt the filter bed. That quiet generosity, as much as the dark stone itself, is why his name survived long after the paint flaked away. So the question stands, and it's the same one that Winter always asks of anyone who faces it. Was Gary Coulter brilliant? Or was he simply one of the few people humble enough to notice what the sun and the stone had been doing together all along? The answer matters less than the example. Because somewhere right now, on a frozen homestead or in a city apartment, someone is staring at a problem that everyone else has accepted as unsolvable. And the solution might be as simple as watching snow melt on a dark rock. Subscribe to witness more stories of forgotten ingenuity, frontier resilience, and the quiet people who changed the world by paying attention. Thanks for watching.